All right. Well, I want to get started to recognize all of your valuable time and say thanks for being on with us today. We changed the format a little bit. One of the things we did, as you are all aware, we did a member survey in the spring of the year in May. And one of the things that we did hear about was, where are the places that MASB talks about and shares with members like things that are like hot topics, things that are happening right now that districts are interested in, concerned about. And as we talked about it, there's a number of answers, and one of them is we really tried to curate our clinic sessions at annual conference to have districts presenting on topics that are of immediate interest. And we do our institutes often where we bring in speakers that will address a topic that's happening. But we also thought, even though this webinar has been going on since COVID and we call it Member Matters, where we're asking you, like, what do you want to talk about? What are the things that are out there? And we do it every 2 months. We also thought this would be an opportunity for us to maybe lead a discussion to start with on something that people are talking a lot about, and then still have time within the webinar format for members to bring up whatever other issues that are out there. And as I look on the screen, I can just from the few that have their screens turned on, I'm like, oh, I'm looking at three board members that have been at least three board members that have been on their boards for a long time. And so I'm like, oh, this is not a topic that is um, maybe something new, but as you saw from how we put it out there today, declining enrollment is something that we want to spend a little time talking about because if you think about the last time we've experienced declining enrollment continually since the early 2000s. So that's no surprise. And we know that districts have ebbed and flowed, but most of you are likely with fewer students now than you were 5 years ago or 10 years ago for sure. But the reality is that um, we are in a space where declining enrollment at a time when we're worried about what state budgets are going to be like are coinciding again for the first time since the middle 2000s. That was the last time where districts were concerned about cuts from the state level, we're getting smaller increases from the state, and experiencing declining enrollment. So since that time, since probably 2010, 11, districts have been seeing adequate increases so that even though you've had declining enrollment, you've been able to manage financially, haven't had many discussions about staff layoffs and things along those lines. And now we're back into the space where we have districts that are in wondering about that financially. And frankly, if we think about 80 to 85 superintendents turning over every year, since then, we've got 15 years worth of new superintendents that haven't dealt with it, and 15 years worth of board members that haven't dealt with it. And so it's a new experience for a lot of our membership. And so without we'd spend some time talking about this, Kent Cartwright is on with us today from our staff. He's the deputy director here. But he also is a 20 plus year CFO at school districts. And so Kent brings a wealth of knowledge, although nobody wants probably the knowledge of how to make cuts because of declining enrollment, and how to lay off staff and things like that. But Kent comes with that experience. And so he and I are going to do a little bit of talking about declining enrollment. You guys can post questions in the chat as you have them. And and as I said, we will also have some time within this to just talk about other issues that you might have. So bring that up. So, Kent, I'm going to start and just have a conversation with you to really talk about this idea. So, I mean, I laid it out, right? We have a lot of people that haven't had the negative experience of what do I do now? And, there's a lot of things within the budget that you deal with and at a local level. But with districts now, they're worried about state budget. Of course, we don't have one yet. Even with that, we're not expecting like some large increase, and we're starting to see districts that are running deficit budgets, at least in the individual year, spending down fund balance. Um, and declining enrollment is one of the things driving that in many of our communities. So, I mean, you were in Petoskey for 20 years. What did you talk to you about your board as you were starting to see that kind of pinch as it relates to finances and loss of students?
Yeah, so what we would talk about is that the issue is not restricted just to your school district. I know, Don, as we talked a little bit here this morning, when Brad and Don and myself were first getting into schools, Proposal A had just passed, and I hate to say it this way, but it feels like back in '94 through 2000, those are like the days of wine and song because we were seeing per pupil foundations going up, and we were also seeing increases in enrollment. And I remember when I got to Petoskey in 2000, I mean, the problem we had was finding enough classroom space for folks. And then things, kind of leveled out. And as you get into about 2006, 2007, at the statewide level, we began to see decreases and have continued to see decreases at about 1.4% loss across the state. That's about 6,000 students every year. And now, is it equally distributed? It certainly is not. And there are districts out there that, for various reasons, maybe they have a large employer move in, but they are seeing increasing enrollment. But again, across the state, we're at about 1.4% loss. And the National Center for Education Statistics says we can expect that to continue forward into the next decade. So this is not a problem that, unfortunately, we're going to see go away very soon. So I would begin with that and say, hey, board, it's not just us. This is a statewide issue. From there, then you begin a discussion of how do we hold what we've got, and are there ways to increase that enrollment? And there certainly are many programs out there that that give opportunities to make your district attractive. Yeah, so am I talking schools of choice? Unfortunately, that's one of them. If you have robust offerings or you have a competitive advantage in some place, that can help you attract students from outside your district. At Petoskey, we had 9 vocational education programs that were very attractive to the students of the smaller districts around us, and would often bring them in there. You have programs out there like early middle college. If you can offer something like that, that becomes attractive, and it's a win-win for the district and the student, a win-win-win, and the parents, because you get the opportunity to do what's best for kids and help the family out by picking up some tuition costs. So there are programs out there that provide opportunities, but you also have to remain cognizant that oftentimes it means you are attracting students at the expense of your neighbors. And sometimes superintendents and boards get a little grumpy about that. So, be aware.
So Ken, one of the things I've heard from districts is just enrollment projections, right? Like whether it's the business manager or there's a couple of organizations in the state that do pupil projections for districts. Sometimes I've heard of districts receiving them, but then ignoring what the data tells them because that can't be right. But if you're gonna go out there and get the data, whether it be from your business manager or somebody outside, like it's pretty important that yes, you can turn the tide with certain things maybe, but the data is still the data, and you can't ignore it as you're looking at your budget projections along with whatever you expect the state to bring in.
Yeah, don't do that. Don't ignore those. The enrollment projections are very inexpensive. I mean, the couple that I used, they were 500 to $1,000. We would do them every other year, and they're statistically accurate. But are they going to give you, are they going to 100% predict what your enrollment is going to be come September. No, but they're going to take the things that are important in your community, yeah, the important facets from your community, and they're going to take a good estimate of, excuse me, what your enrollment is going to look like by grade level. What does your incoming kindergarten class look like? What does your outgoing senior graduating class look like? And that right there will give you a good indication. If I've got more seniors graduating than I have kindergartners coming in, well, there's a built-in decline right there. And we have to recognize that. And a good enrollment projection will give you an idea of, can you predict the need to perhaps do something with your buildings, your classroom space, things like that. They are they're an excellent and inexpensive piece of data that helps you make good, informed choices and decisions.
I think back into the mid 2000s or late 2000s when we had a recession and we were fighting declining enrollment and seeing boards that this is a tough spot that a board gets put in, right? Like I can remember, we were talking about, Shelley and I were talking about, I was just in Marquette yesterday for an MASB event. I can remember the Marquette Public School Board making a decision to close, I think it was an elementary building, and they actually had recalls against those board members, but they were making a decision based on the enrollment patterns that they saw in their district and the overall numbers. And I mean, they in essence were doing what they had to do. And in the end, when some of those board members were gone and people replaced them, they realized, oh, yep, that was the only decision that could have been made. But on the flip side, I know districts that didn't go down that road because they were afraid of, they got a bunch of public pushback or they were afraid of the recall effort, and they left buildings open. And eventually they closed them, but they closed them probably 5 years too late because they should have seen the enrollment projections and said, man, we really have to make the tough decision now and start saving that operational cash to be used within the district in other ways.
Yeah. So my mentor, when I first started in the business, he said, Kent, if you would like to see your boardrooms packed, go to your budget and mess with the 3 or the 4 B's: balls, busing, and buildings, and band. Band is the 4th one. And yet those are 4 areas that, that there's some money there, especially in the building side, but there's a lot of emotion wrapped up in the community. And so it's not, and what he was telling me was, don't not look at them, but understand that they take more time and more effort and a lot of communication, because you have to bring your community along. I mean, if you think about that building, Petoskey had a 1927 elementary school, a beautiful building. And there were discussions about, whether that was inefficient and did the enrollment not support us keeping it open? And those are hard decisions. I mean, people were like, my grandparents went to school there. So what you have to do is you have to get out ahead of it as early as possible. And you take those enrollment projections and you show your community, and then you take you have to figure out what your built-in fixed costs are for running that building. And what's a fixed cost? Well, you got to heat it. You got to run, all your utilities to it. But that's not where the real money is. You also have to staff it. And sure, you might need those teachers and they may end up in another building, but you have a whole administrative team, you have a custodial team, you have a food service team, you have a lot of people in there that if opportunities come along where people are retiring or they decide to move on to another district or another career, you may have an opportunity, if you're closing that building, to not replace them and save some money. And unfortunately, in our budgets, I mean, the average district is spending about 72% of its budget on salaries and fringe benefits. And so it's really, really hard to balance a budget that's out of whack without without touching people. So, the challenge is to recognize opportunities where you can trim your personnel costs without having to issue pink slips. And that's a challenge that it can be done, but you have to be thinking about, what are we, where are we headed and what are we trying to accomplish?
Kurt posted a question out to the audience, not to MASB. What is the range of school choice enrollment as a percentage of your total enrollment in your district? And if you're interested, just share that. Like how many schools of choice kids do you have in your district? And I know it varies substantially. Kent, you mentioned
Drink, Mom. Yeah. Want some water? There you go, buddy.
make sure you're muted on that your end unless you're talking. Um, you mentioned staff, and that is the thing probably in the last year that I've started hearing from board members, even some soups in conversation. Uh, Districts have not had to do layoffs in really for many of them in quite a while. And so that is now a question that's coming up. Like that's a tough space to be like, these are often people in your community, you're a local board member, you didn't sign up. You signed up to lift up your district and the community and all of this. You didn't sign up to lay off people. And then couple that with COVID spending, which in some districts caused the number of people that are employed by the district to bump up. And now you've got this double whammy of more staff than you had before and budget situations that may be causing layoff. And I think it's just been a difficult place for some districts to even consider it. And board members are like, I didn't know that we were going to do that. So, I mean, I know that's maybe short-sighted for somebody to run for a board and not think that might become a reality, but I mean, I also understand why it hurts them so much to think about having to do that.
Yeah, that is the tough part of being a board member and being an administrator in districts during tough budget times, because again, if you have a significant shortfall, you almost cannot rectify it without in some way impacting people. And those people are your neighbors, they're your constituents, they're the folks that you run into in the grocery store. And that's not a fun place to be. So what you try to do is you look for opportunities, as I suggested, if you've got somebody who's choosing to retire, that's a great time to examine, do I need to replace that person? Because they're going off on their own because they want to, so there's no hard feelings. But now you have an opportunity, if that position is, say, a 25-year teaching veteran, that's probably about $150,000 position right there. And if you can find a way to not fill that, that's a nice savings. If you do fill it, you're still going to get some savings because your average brand new teacher right out of college here in the state of Michigan is going to cost your budget about $85,000. So, but those are the kind of things in this environment that a CFO like myself is watching very carefully. Where districts get themselves in trouble in declining enrollment is they see that the enrollment is going down, but they don't take the opportunities to balance their staffing levels against their declining enrollment. So if your staffing stays like this, but your enrollment is going down like that, your revenue coming in, you're creating a mismatch. You're keeping the costs, but you're actually losing the revenue. And I think that is probably, if there are no other options on the table, the key is you've got to keep that balance between your enrollment as it goes down, and you've got to do something with your staffing. And it's not easy because you don't lose 30 kids in a grade. You lose a couple in this grade, a couple in that grade, a couple in that grade. So this is the kind of thing that you have to keep a constant eye on, because eventually over a 2 to 4 year period of time, you will find there will be a grade or a class or something that you're like, you know what, we can do some shuffling around and, we can save $150,000 because that teacher is retiring and we don't have to replace them. That is, unfortunately, that's your best case scenario, for keeping your community happy and yet still trying to make the budget work.
Interesting. I want to birdwalk a little bit, Kent, and then we'll get off this topic. But schools of choice clearly became a conversation and people are posting. And I see a few posting and saying that they're trying to draw down their numbers of schools of choice because they're either stabilizing on resident or even growing a little bit in the residential area as far as residential students. And, that is, I haven't heard much about it lately, but I can think of school districts that were really pushing schools of choice for a number of years and getting to a point, and we see some of the percentages, 34% or 50%. And when you go out for a bond issue because you need to replace or repair, and you're explaining to your voters that 50% or 30% of the kids in your district aren't from your district. So when you're paying the tax on whatever it is you need, these individuals aren't going to be contributing to that bond issue. That has been a rub for some districts in dealing with that. At the same time, if I'm in a building and I'm just doing it I'm not building new buildings, I'm just doing this to stabilize enrollment and keep my buildings full, like whether you had 30% of your students or you didn't, you would still need to do the renovations on the building. But thankfully, I haven't heard much in the bond space where districts are getting that pushback. But I just see those percentages and remember that time when that was out there.
Yeah. So the idea, if you were to step back and look at schools of choice and where does it make sense and when do you stop, and you're an economist or a financial person, you're looking in that building and you're saying, is every classroom have a teacher, and is every teacher's class size, a reasonable size? And if you're doing that, you are now generating as much revenue as you can in that facility, which is keeping that teacher and those staff employed. That's another way of looking at this, is when you're keeping the family intact when you are, maximizing the number of students that you have in a facility. You do have issues out there when, if you pass on schools of choice and suddenly you have a half full building, now you may end up having to go down that road of making the community mad because you're starting to talk about having to close that facility. So two sides of the same coin. It comes down to communication and engaging your community and saying, here's what we're thinking and here's why we're thinking it. Do you want to keep these beautiful old buildings open? And do you want to keep these staff employed? Our money's tied to, unfortunately, student butts and seats.
Yeah. So, Dan, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Don. I'm one of the ones who posted that we've been flexing our schools of choice numbers downward because we have increasing resident enrollment. One of the things that we did that I really recommend if your district is if you're a gainer in schools of choice, if you gain more students than you lose, is do a right sizing exercise. So work with your building administrators, work with your community leaders, work with your students to figure out what size you want to be in order to offer the things that you want to be able to offer to your students, whether that's in terms of basic instruction or whether it's AP classes, extracurriculars, sports teams, whatever. Figure out how many students you want to be able to deliver the offerings that you need to deliver. And then because we're a gainer in schools of choice, we were able to say, okay, we want to be at 3850. That's our target number. And we're going to have 3720 resident students this year. So we want to bring in 130 schools of choice students. We get 200 to 300 to 500 applications every year for schools of choice. So it was easy for us to say, all right, we're going to take this many. And as we've started to draw that down, we basically limit it to first grade, sixth grade, and ninth grade now. And we can still keep our enrollment number right there where we want it.
Yes, Dan, I think, what you're talking about is very similar to what I was suggesting, which is a district looks at its enrollment and its capacity, and you're doing that, and you're saying this works for our facilities and our budget, and that's how you establish how many open seats you have, and as a target. And if it's something that is baked into your budgeting process, even better. It's good to have those conversations. I think, sometimes where districts might get themselves in trouble is they just kind of open the floodgates. And sometimes if you're not monitoring it, you can actually get too many students in there and begin to get teachers who will begin to complain about, excessive class size, or in extreme examples, you may run out of classroom space. I mean, I go back to the early 2000s where we were having increasing enrollment. And if you were to go into Petoskey High School and open a couple of closets, you might go, why does this closet have a fire flasher in it? Well, because in 2000, it was somebody's office, and that was fire code, because we had so many kids, we were stuffing them and staff into every crook and, every little spot we could. So it is a balancing act.
I see somebody posted the concern with the schools of choice of recruiting schools of choice students, and actually going ones that don't even border their district. And I've been around forever, so I was involved legislatively when this all started happening, and then the expansion of schools of choice beyond your contiguous borders and to any within your ISD. And there was a period of time where within counties, there was at least I'll say gentle persons agreement among superintendents and boards that districts weren't going to advertise. Like if people came knocking on your door for schools of choice, I mean, you were required under law to at least put out if you had slots available. But that's different than, we see billboards, right? I mean, from a district or districts around the state now. And so that is a tough space when I think about, you as a board member sitting there. And the other issue is we have now, this never used to happen years ago, but like school buses from other districts now driving into your district to pick up kids to make it easy to get them into school, sort of thing. And that's, sometimes they have to do it because of the way your districts are configured. You just have buses that will be driving through parts of your district. But we also know that under schools of choice, we have districts taking that step, which when this first started, it never happened. And, schools of choice becomes a long bird walk about, what's happening in schools of choice. If you were to poll members of MASB, probably, and I think there's still this idea that, charter schools have really had this negative impact on school population numbers in traditional public schools. And you're not wrong from a holistic statewide perspective. But when you think of it as a district, it would be very rare for you to find a district that has lost more kids to charter schools than schools of choice. Schools of choice has caused far more kids to be outside of a district than charter schools have in most districts. And that's not for me to judge what the other districts are doing. You're all trying to survive and make things work, and you're providing things, as Kent started off with, that are attractive for students that another district might not be able to provide. But like that is definitely one of those areas that is a little bit of a rub. I mean, schools of choice, as wide open as we have it in Michigan, across county boundaries and all of that, like it is, really hard for districts to manage, not knowing how many kids are going to show up at the end of August when you open school, because you don't know how many you can guess based on trends like Kent has talked about, but schools of choice really creates a dynamic that makes it hard to manage the budgetary space. I see a question, Kurt, what does a potential government shutdown look like relative impact on public schools? Any new initiatives to recruit and retain teachers? So Jen is not on today because We were doing a legislative piece up in Marquette yesterday, and she's traveling back today. So potential government shutdown, where it's the most immediate effect on schools is October 20th is the state aid payment date. To get everything in the system, what people are really saying is the legislature needs to have a budget in place by October 10th to make sure that it's not messing with your October state aid payment. However, if you're in an ISD and all of your ISDs offer GSRP for 3 and 4 year olds, the way that ISDs are funded on that is different. And they're saying actually, if by October 5th a budget is not settled, it is very likely that ISDs might be calling their partners that offer these programs and telling them they are not going to be able to pay them for the month of October. Now, as far as what are we seeing out of the legislature, we're hearing that meetings are happening and that, leadership and the governor think that the deal's going to get done. Lansing is one of those small towns that if things are happening, the rumors usually get let out. Like it's hard to keep things quiet. And I will say from talking to Jen, not much is getting out. So I wonder how effective, I think there are conversations, but how effective they are right now. Although Jen would say she also doesn't expect, if there is a shutdown of government, that it lasts very long, meaning like days, not weeks, but just like days. One of the things that plays into this is October 1st is on a Wednesday this year. Yom Kippur is on Thursday. That is a day that they are not in session scheduled. And that holiday actually starts, or that holy day actually starts at sundown on the 1st. And so we would expect that the legislature will want to be done working on the 1st by 5 or 6 o'clock to make sure that people that want to be able to get home in time are going to be able to do that. So some people are like, yep, that's going to be their deadline, right? They're going to go into the 1st and be shut down, but they know they have to get a deal done by 5 o'clock so that state will be shut down for a day and then nothing after that. I don't know that's just pure speculation on the part of people. I saw somebody on over the weekend that is a part of, that would be a part of conversations, thought that like there will be a deal done. I think for education, our biggest question may not be whether a deal is done, but how much is taken from K-12 education to get that deal done. Sadly for us, the school aid fund has some money in it. The general fund is the one that's struggling. And so our worst case scenario, as they try to get a deal on roads as part of this, and both the House and the governor have said no budget without a roads deal. Our fear has to be they take away the sales tax on gasoline, which is close to $1 billion cost to the school aid fund. They increase the income tax percentage so they can tell the public we've made up that $1 billion loss. We're going to trade off. So now the revenue coming into the school aid fund is not hurt. And then they transfer I think it's about 1.2 or 1.5 billion that currently the general fund spends on higher education. And they move all of that into the school aid fund, which is harder to explain to the people and to the public. And so in the end, the school aid fund still loses over $1 billion, or I should say K-12 loses over $1 billion, but we lose it to higher ed. We don't lose it in revenue. It's just that the state decides to spend money differently. I think that's really our biggest risk, and I think Jen would agree with that, is not whether we're shut down for a day or 2 days. Very few people think that we're going to be at October 10th and not have a budget done. It's going to be how hard can we work to protect K-12 student funding? It's not even the school aid fund, but K-12 student funding is the piece that I think we really have to look at. Let's see. Piggybacking, what should we be looking now to prepare to close our doors if we don't get out state aid grants? Stan, good question. That's something that's come up now is, really, and Kent, you can tune in or chime in on this, but what MSBO, they sent out an email to all of your business officials a week ago to say you should be looking at your cash flow projections right now and talking to your local banks about what a loan will look like at whatever time, whether that's in October or November or December, because the process for getting that loan is a little different than what you normally deal with. And you want to be in to that, at least have your business manager know the answers and the bank's prepared to be able to do it in case something happens that would cause us to go, into October and then beyond that.
Yeah, if I was your CFO, the first thing I would be doing is I'd have a plan A, and plan A is your budget's already there. But then I would have a plan B, which says, hey, we don't get a state aid payment in October. What does that do to my cash flow? And then I'd have a plan C that says, what happens if we don't have a budget into November? Do I think that's going to happen? No, but that's what you hire, conservative CFOs for, is to worst case scenario this stuff. Once I've got my cash flows in front of me, then I'm going to go chat with the local banks, and I'm going to say, okay, and I'm going to find somebody who we have a relationship with, because this is not something that normally happens. And if you can at least get them to commit to to an interest rate that's prime or prime plus a fraction, that's probably what you're looking at, and that's going to be much more expensive than your school bond loan or your state aid cash borrowing, but it is an avenue. And then what I would do if I were your CFO is I would be talking to you and saying, I'm going to ask, we're going to go talk to legal counsel and begin to get the resolutions in place and put them in front of you so that those are in place and you can then react quickly to whatever happens out there. You will, as a board, you have to take action before you do any kind of borrowing like that. So the more you can do ahead of time, the more nimble you are to react to whatever the situation is. So now your cash flow, though some districts may not have as big of an issue, cash flow is unique to each district, though most districts who collect their property taxes largely in the winter, which is the default stance. Your cash low point is actually about the second or third week of December, but that is assuming that you get your state aid in October and November, and those are the two that you have to worry about. And for districts,
oh, sorry, Kent.
Yeah, for districts that are getting a chunk of their change in the summer, you will have a different cash flow look and profile. You still want to do the work, you still want to do the legwork, and I guess the last thing is the difference between, when I was talking with Jen and I was looking at this, the difference between this potential shutdown and the last time that we did this is the last time there was a shutdown, there was no money. At least this time, we may get a haircut, a pretty drastic one, but at least there's money in the pot, which is a heck of I feel better. I don't feel good about the situation, but this sucks less. Let's put it that way.
Amy, I see your hand. I wanted two other things that in relationship to Stan's question, because you also said, Stan, you said close your doors. And so I will tell you that, I mean, that piece of conversation is out there amongst districts. And, for those that have been around forever, Proposal A, and we are not in a place that our school funding system is broken, but Kalkaska closed their doors to really help leverage a situation to come to a solution on school funding. And so that is a space where, I mean, districts are out there thinking about, well, why would we borrow? Let's just shut down and let the legislature know that this is a problem. And I mean, clearly that's a local decision. I think there's a lot of negative ramifications for a district in that situation, but I also understand why somebody might take that stance. And Stan, you also mentioned the amount of interest for loans. And I think that is a great talking point that can be made right now, both to your legislators as you're contacting them and your public that you're talking. I mean, we already see the notes going home. We're not going to do free lunch after October 1st. Oh, like, hey, we're going to have to borrow money, and just understand that for every month that we are borrowing money, that's the interest is going to be the salary and benefits of one teacher, right? Like that's a way to make it real for them. Not that you're laying off, but that's how much it costs. So, I would just want to point that out there. Amy, your hand was up and now I see it disappeared, but do you still have something?
Well, you kind of hit what I was going to ask Don. And then also, Kent, I wanted to know overall, say I have half my board is new. Overall, what are the main questions that we should be asking the CFO and the superintendent general without getting into the nitty gritty, without making anybody worried? These new board members, I don't want them dropping off and jumping off. Is it just strictly how long do we have to operate without state funding?
If I were your CFO, I would expect you to say, all right, Cartwright, do you have a cash flow? And I tell you yes. And have you modified that cash flow under, the possible scenarios that MSBO, MASA, and MASB are talking about? And hopefully you would get an answer that says, yeah, I have 3 different scenarios or 5 different scenarios or whatever. And then, ask, is there anything that we can do to get ready? And my response would be, yeah, let's get some resolutions. Let's talk to legal counsel. Let's at least make it, the solution is a short-term borrowing. Unfortunately, let's put the legwork in place. And I think you can do it in that manner without raising undue alarm. And then, maybe have a finance committee. If you don't have one, form one perhaps, and get maybe mix up some experienced board members with inexperienced, and then sit them down and then ask some of the hard questions. Well, Cartwright, what assumptions are you using? What do you got? What's this? Can you show us some of this stuff? And in that way, you can begin to develop that relationship and the knowledge for those new board members. But
Perfect. Thank you.
you're welcome.
Yeah, somebody also put out there, what about spending freezes?
Spending freezes, let's be honest, 5% of your budget is in supplies. Okay. And certainly you can do that, but the Paul Harvey rest of the story is in that 5% is your electricity and your gas, and you can't shut those down. You just are not going to get a much bang for your buck, putting a freeze on. And actually, you've probably already purchased your crayons and your paper and your edible paste for your classrooms. Purchase services, you might have a little bit there, but again, that's about 12 to 13% of most school budgets is in purchase services. But for many of us, that includes our substitute teachers. If you privatized your busing, that's part of that 13%, and you've got your sewer and water. So, and this goes back to some of my earliest comments of, it's so hard to affect your budget without touching people. So, though there is a political positive to it, and that is it raises awareness. And so maybe that's a purpose, that's a good purpose. Because let's face it, if our parents get mad, there's enough parents out there that legislators will hear the noise. Right now, they're hearing it from you and I and from professional educators. But when the parents get ticked off, I can tell you up in Charlevoix and Emmett County, that got attention.
Yeah, communicating this to let them know that, because they want to blame, they don't know all the machinations. And so when you're borrowing, when you're doing cuts or freezes, like a lot of your voters are going to think that it's your fault or your district's fault if you're not communicating what's happening here, because they don't understand how funding for schools works in Michigan. So make sure that you're communicating. And in some ways, the free lunch program that we've had for the last couple of years has been a blessing in the scope that many districts have had. It's a blessing for its actual purpose, but in this situation, it's a blessing because you have spent September communicating about its possible end because of state budget. So it has been something that has allowed you to communicate about the legislature causing you a problem that probably has helped to garner some parent backing on your side of things. So I think it's a positive. Kurt, you posted on state categoricals. Honestly, and I think Jen would attest to this, we don't have any idea right now on categoricals. Like it is the Senate, House, and governor's budgets, as you all know, were so different from each other that it's normally that would not be the case. And we would be like, oh, it looks like two of the three are looking to get rid of this category. Like there is so little commonality between the budgets and what they look like, and so little conversation happen. I mean, nobody's talking about the state aid budget. They're just talking about the budget, and they're talking about gas, fixing the roads. And so, I mean, it would be purely a guess to say what categoricals might be on the chopping block or not on the chopping block at this point, because nobody's talking about them. Like I don't think when we think of the big ones, at risk, special ed, they probably are pretty safe. It is the smaller categoricals. We talk, what are they going to do for retirement as a categorical? What does that look like? That would be one, because that's always out there for conversation. New program type things that people were trying to get from businesses, like those are always at risk. Probably the newer a categorical is, the more likely that people look at getting rid of it, because it's not been something a district has built into their budgets regularly. But purely a guess if we were to say what that is. So I don't even want to get into that space and do that. Man, we're at 12:50 already and talked a lot of budget, and which is what you guys were asking. Ken, it looked like you were about to say something, but I might have.
Yeah, I think the proposal that has everyone's attention is the one that kind of rolls all the categoricals up into one big lump sum, foundation allowance payment. And when I looked at that, again, with my CFO hat on, I'm like, you know what? We've already got an adopted budget. We have an educational plan. So if you've got those programs in your budget and the funding just happens to come as a all through foundation allowance, you're totally fine with peeling that piece off of this now large foundation allowance and putting it towards those programs, at least to get you through this year. So it's a concern that the categoricals are changing, but it is there are solutions, I think, because you do have your budget in place. You've got a plan.
Yeah, I would also say, like Ken's point about the House budget that rolled that I'm all in. So the governor ran it as a traditional budget. The Senate ran it as a traditional budget. I am not expecting to see a big roll up of categoricals into a foundation grant. I think right now we've got two of the three looking at a more traditionally based budget. I expect the in the end that the budget will, I could be wrong, but like that it'll go in a more traditional sense, and not be reflective of what the House's budget looked like. Brooke, you made the point about House leadership, saying that we are all talking about these issues about borrowing and layoffs and pink slips. And in essence, he brushed that off and said, oh, they're just, they are just kind of posers, like to say that, this is to alarm, families and everything else. I would agree. Like it is ridiculous to think that a school district would not be making these plans for borrowing and doing all the things that you have to do, because they would equally beat us up if we hit October 20th and you had not made those plans because they didn't get the budget done. So much rather have them beat us up for bringing this stuff up and saying that we need to do it than to get beat up for actually not doing it all. That is good sound management practice for you as a board and you as a district. Make the plans, tell your public, and ignore House leadership saying that you're just doing that to scare people. I thought those comments were unfounded and ridiculous. And we actually responded with a press release response back from a number of the education groups saying it's absolutely our job to be planning like this.
They want us to operate schools like a business, and that's what a good business does, is it has contingency plans and it looks to the future and it watches its cash flow and it identifies threats to that.
Yep. I know we only have about 7 minutes left, and it might not be enough time. I will say we had a board meeting on Friday, and maybe we've moved outside of this far enough. But Brad did a presentation to our board on social media posts and how it impacts your employees, because we've seen that come up recently. And Brad, if you would, I would just like if you would just touch on it, kind of the legalities related to free speech related to public employees, so that if it's a question in anybody's mind, even if we don't get to everything today, they can at least reach out to you if you have any kind of clarifying questions. Uh, Kurt, I wouldn't say it was good news. It was really legal, just about what a district should be doing and how you would follow the law. And so if it's something that you are maybe have experienced in your district or you're worried about, I would say just reach out directly to Brad and have him run you through it. This is even something, last week we had an all-staff meeting at MASB, and even though MASB staff are not public employees, we are now in a world where we see people making posts on social media that, depending right or left, doesn't matter, that sometimes that individual company all of a sudden gets taken to task for an employee's comments, whether that's the view of the company or not. And we had to just tell staff we can't police their ability to speak, but at the same time, they're an employee of MASB and they could be tied to us organizationally, whatever they say in these forums, and we could be forced as an employer, if it harms the reputation of MASB to a point, even if it's because somebody drummed up angst and numbers of people posting online. It doesn't matter. It can have that negative impact, and it's just a tough space, and it's a tough space for you as leaders, and differently because there are free speech protections for public employees, and it varies, and that's where I really want to be at Brad, and Brad did touch with our board. Let's see, Barb. Teacher sued on free speech. Yeah, and as Yasmin said, and she's on our board right now. One of the things that Brad did bring up is whether it disrupts educational practice and learning within your district. That's really one of the big things that a board has to look at. It's not whether, somebody threw it up there from your school district and a handful of people on Facebook are making an issue of it and they've contacted your district. Is it impacting and disrupting what's
Hey,
happening?
Don, can you hear
Brad,
me?
I can hear you now.
Boy, I had some serious technical difficulties there. If people are willing to stay a couple minutes, I can quickly go through the analysis. I know you talked about it a little bit, but what it comes down to is, teachers have a First Amendment right, but or any staff employee has a First Amendment right, but it's limited to the point where are those comments, communications disruptive to the school district to the point where it's disrupting the learning environment. It's making it difficult for the individual to perform their duties as a staff member. So there's an analysis that goes into it, and That's why you see a lot of these individuals being placed on leave when their comments, may have crossed the line, is because it's simply not okay, that's a bad comment, you're going to get disciplined. No, there's a lot of analysis that goes into it, and what type of impact, those comments are having, on the school district.
Well, I appreciate you fighting through the technical difficulty and being able to share that.
Yeah, I can't even get my video to come up at this point, but at least my audio is working.
Yasmin, we really didn't need that last comment. I'm looking at Mark's background with the big Lions helmet, and
Kurt was looking for some positive news and vibes, so
ah,
I was helping him out.
I can appreciate that. That was a big win for the Lions. Baltimore is a tough game. Cleveland should not have been a tough game. Okay, Kurt, now that's a little harsh now to say go Browns. Like, just for that, I'm going to end this right now. I'm going to hit the end button on this meeting. Well, thanks everybody. Thanks, Kent, for joining us today and sharing your experience as it relates to budget cuts, declining enrollment. Thanks everybody for joining. Encourage other board members on your board to join if they have the space in their schedule to do these. We're just trying to share information. I would expect when we come back in 2 months, we'll find a topic again that we think that members are telling us about, that we want to address specifically. Just thank you very much for all that you're doing in your districts, and hopefully we will have a budget by October 1st, and it will be one that is at least cut free from an education perspective, so that you can get through this year without having to make any changes in your programs and offerings. So thanks very much. Have a great day.